Hi guys. We are going to start our module on the web technologies, right? Fundamentally, it's going to be covering the components, the tools, the methods, the approaches that we use in order to create web pages, right? In their full variety. Today we're gonna start talking about HTML and a little bit about the structure of the web in a very sort of pragmatic way. There's going to be another video that covers sort of the history and the theory behind the internet and the web and all the related technologies. But today we're going to start looking explicitly at how web pages are built and how you can build one yourself, right? So we're gonna start talking about HTML. We're gonna look at the tool set that you are going to need, and we're going to start sort of separating different concerns into different pockets, right? So what HTML does, then we'll talk a little bit about what CSS is, and there's going to be another component video that's going to cover CSS and all the details, and then another one is going to be about JavaScript, right? So those are the three main tools that we use for the creation of web pages, right? But first, let's look at what a web page is and what are some of the tools that we need to use and some of the concepts that we need to grasp in order to work with it. So here's an example domain. This is a fairly well-known web page. It basically just shows you an example web page, right? As simple as it gets, right? But it does contain all the components that we need to look at when we talk about the web pages, right? Right away, we're going to start looking at some of the tools that we're going to need, and our first and most important tool is going to be Web Inspector, right? So every browser has it. I'm using Firefox, so you'll find it in Firefox. You will also find it in Chrome and in Safari and in Internet Explorer and Edge and whatever other browsers you might want to use. So the easiest and the simplest way to access it is to right click somewhere on the page, and you will find an inspect option right there, right? So this will open up a console. It might open up on the bottom of the page, not on the side like for me, but that's an option that can easily be rectified, right? So there are always those little settings for those tools, so you can dock this on the bottom. I prefer it on the right, so you can do it on the left, and you can even pop it out as a separate window, right? So now we're looking at how the browser sees a web page, right? And these are very, very fundamental concepts that I think it's worth kind of getting into a little bit. So what does it mean for a browser to see a web page? So first and foremost, then let's start with what a browser is. So a browser is a special application. It's a program that's running on your computer and your operating system, and its job is to interpret web pages. That's its number one job, right? And facilitate all the necessary functionality around requesting web pages, displaying web pages, managing all the data that's related to the display and display of the web pages, and so on and so forth. Okay, so all right, so we've established browser is a special application that does that, right? So in order to do this, it adheres to a certain set of standards that has been agreed upon by the World Wide Web Consortium. You can take a look at their webpage. It's W3C. So if you just do Google search for W3C, it can come up with w3c.org. It's World Wide Web Consortium. That's the body of it's an organization. It's a sort of like a governing body of the web, right? A whole bunch of companies that care about the web, they come together and they write all these standards and guidelines to help everybody build a web base on the principles of accessibility, internationalization, privacy, and security, right? So Google is a part of it, Microsoft is a part of it, Apple is a part of it. They're all a part of it, and you personally can actually become a part of it if you're so interested in, if you have like a certain stake in particular features um, on the web, right? And you can submit proposals and offer your own better way of doing web, right? And people might agree, and then your standard is going to be adopted, right? So what that means that every single browser um, interprets web pages in the same way, right? More or less. There's going to be some small differences, and there's a little bit of like push and pull, and Chrome will do its own tiny little thing, and Firefox will do its own tiny little thing. But in general, 99% of the stuff they're going to share, and they're going to look at it in the same exact way and interpret those pages the same way. Okay, so that's one component, what a web browser is. Then what's a web page? Right? So it's kind of like this mysterious thing. You type in the URL address in your browser and it pops up. Um, the mystery can be demystified, and in reality, it's just a file. It's a text file, actually, that lives on somebody else's computer, right? So that's what servers are. They're somebody else's computer. You can turn your own personal computer into a server if you ever so choose. Basically, that means that you need to open it up for people to be able to access it from outside, which is what the main difference between a server and a regular computer is, right? Server is a computer that other people can access from outside of its own little subdomain. Again, not being crazy super technical here, just general idea, right? So, all right. So what that means is that an HTML page is just a text document that lives on a folder in somebody's computer, right, on somebody's server, and you can access this document. And as long as this document is written according to specific sets of rules, again, which are being set by the W3C consortium, the browser will interpret it correctly, right? And so we can do the same thing. We can, instead of requesting that file from somebody else's computer, right, which is what normally browser does, we can request it from our own computer. We can tell the browser that, hey, I have an HTML file. Please open it up for me and interpret it the way you would interpret any other HTML document. Okay, so that means that we should be able to create this text document, since it's a text document, right? So in order to create it, we need another tool. So browser with its inspector panel or web developer panel or whatever other browsers would call this panel is number one tool, right, for us to work with the web. And then the other major component is going to be a text editor, right? You can use any text editor if you wanted to, right? You can use Notepad on Windows, you can use TextEdit on Microsoft, and save your files as HTML, and it's going to work. But for the sake of little shortcuts and little sort of like add-on tools that might be very helpful, I recommend finding a text editor that's specifically fine-tuned for writing more than just text, right? For writing HTML, for writing CSS, JavaScript, and maybe other programming languages. And there are tons of them out there. You can find Brackets or Atom or whatever you prefer. I prefer VS Code, right? So VS Code stands for Visual Studio Code. It's a little text editor that's made by Microsoft, and it's available for both Mac and PC, right? So if you want to install something like this, all you have to do is go to just Google VS Code, right? And it will come up, download Visual Studio Code for Mac, Linux, and Windows. One important thing is the difference between Visual Studio Code, which is a fairly small and fairly lightweight source code editor, right? And Visual Studio, right? We're going to be using, or I'm going to be using, you're free to use whatever you want, but I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code. Notice this blue ribbony logo, right? As opposed to Visual Studio, in Visual Studio, notice actually, let me see, where's the, oh, yeah, there you go. See, notice this purple, slightly different ribbony logo, right? That's an integrated development environment. So this is more complicated. It's basically the differences between a sailboat and an aircraft carrier, right? So we don't need an aircraft carrier to go on a nice little boat ride, which is what we're doing here. A sailboat is going to be much more than enough for us, right? So this is where we're going to Visual Studio Code. So if you don't have it installed yet, I highly recommend download and install it. I already have it installed. So what I'm going to do, I am going to then create a new folder just to keep myself organized. I'm going to create a new folder on the desktop, and I'm going to call it, let's rename it to first website, right? Or whatever you might want to call it. And then we are going to open this up in Visual Studio Code, right? So I already have it installed, so I'm going to launch it. The installation process is fairly simple. All you have to do is just download and drag and drop into your whatever folder you want, like programs folder on Windows or applications folder on a Mac, right? And then I'm going to launch it and open that folder from within Visual Studio Code. Okay, so I'm going to, all right, so here I have a new window, right, with a bunch of options, right? And then you can either create a new file or you can open a location on your computer. So I'm going to be on the desktop, and this is my first website. So I'm going to open up this folder. So it might pop up with something, with a notification like this, basically saying like, hey, I don't know who made this folder and who wrote the code that might be in this folder, even though we don't have any code, but who knows, right? Do you want to trust the authors and allow full access? Yes, I trust myself. I'm the one who created it. So let's trust them, right? So right now that folder is empty, right? So there's this little explorer thing that will show you all the files in this folder, right? And so I'm gonna create a new file. It's gonna be an HTML file, and I'm going to call it index.html. Why index.html? Simply because it's a convention, right? Index, in the very beginning, in the very early days of the web, index was supposed to be the page that kind of shows you the other pages that's available from this server, kind of like an index in a book. And then it kind of became the de facto homepage for a website. And basically all the servers right now are configured in such a way that if you go to a particular location and you don't specify which file you want from that location, it will serve automatically index.html file if there is one in this location, right? So we'll see how that works, but the way I phrase it should give you a hint that just like we created a folder on our computer where we're going to host our file, right? A location on the web is, again, in maybe somewhat simplified terms, but you can think of a location on the web as a folder on somebody's computer that you're allowed to access through your browser, right? And dropping some of the technicalities of how exactly the browser does that, we might get into that a little bit later. Let's just kind of hang on to this idea that a location on the web is a folder on somebody's computer. Okay. All right. So we have index.html. So now let's compare our index.html with an example website. So over here in the inspector, you see search HTML, and it kind of tells you like there's some HTML here and there popping up. So that's the HTML contents of this page. So you will notice that it has kind of like this HTML right here written between the two angular brackets, and then this HTML, very similar but with the slash in the beginning. And then we have, if I click on this triangle right here, we'll have two elements that are sitting between these two tags. This is what they're called: opening tag and closing tag. The one with the slash is going to be a closing tag. The without is going to be an opening tag, right? So the idea of a tag is that it encapsulates a certain amount of content. So an HTML tag will encapsulate your entire HTML page, right? So, and tags are kind of like the fundamental building block of HTML as a language, right? So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. Outside of what hypertext is, and without getting too far into the specifics and the history of the term, let's just say that hypertext is the text that has a certain hyper quality to it, right? And that certain hyper quality, for our intents and purposes, is very simply the ability to link from one piece of text to another piece of text, right? So like the fact that if I click on this more information, it's going to open another page for me, right? That's the link. That's the anchor that connects one page and sort of like drops the line from one page to another page and anchors it there, right? And establishes this link. Right, so if your piece of text is capable of creating links like that, it is a hypertext, right? So we've dealt with the HT part of the HTML, and then the markup language part is simply stands for the fact that the text on the page is structured in a particular way, right? So we've injected a certain amount of structure, and this is what markup is. Markup is a specific structure where we say, like, this piece of text would dedicate to be X, and this piece of text would dedicate to be Y and Z, and so on and so forth, right? So each piece of the text, each piece of the content really on the page is then marked up with a particular label of what it is, how it's supposed to function, what it's supposed to do. And this is how browsers interpret your markup documents, because you're telling them what it is and how it's supposed to function in this markup, in this particular case, the hypertext markup language, right? So going back to this idea, we're marking up the entire content as HTML. And then here we have two components, head and body. So if you notice, body is in blue and head is kind of in gray. And that's simply because the body of the document is everything that you see on the page, right? In this rectangle right here, right, like where all the content is in your browser, that's the body of your document. The head of your document is information about the document, right? It's also known as meta information, right? So beyond information or information about information. So here are some of the things that are contained there. Title of the page, right? Example domain. This is our title, and you will find it right there. Example domain. This is where that title sits, right? Again, opening tag, closing tag. We start our title here, and we end our title right there. That's this. Everything that's between the opening and the closing tag is going to be the title of our document, right? And then we have meta information about the character set. It's UTF-8. If you were curious what it is, go look it up, find it on Google, what UTF-8 stands for, right? There is a little bit of information about the content, right? It's text HTML with a char set of UTF-8, and then a little bit of information about the viewport, how we're supposed to view this page, or more precisely how the browser is supposed to show it to us, right? And we were saying, like, this page is going to occupy the entire width of the device, so the width of the page is equal to the width of the device, and the initial scale has to be 1, so don't zoom in, don't zoom out, just present it at the scale that we want it to be presented, okay? So there's a little bit of meta information here, and then there's another thing called style, and that's a style tag, and it contains a little bit of CSS text, right? And so we'll talk about what CSS is in more details in another module, but for right now, you can think about CSS as just styling, ornamentation. right? This is why we will find things like background color for the body and the font family that we're using and so on and so forth. But again, more about that later, right? So the head, so everything that sits between the opening and the closing tags of the head will be information about the page. And then inside the body will be the contents of the page itself. So we have probably the simplest, the most common component of a web page, the most generic component, you can also say that, a div, right? And div just simply stands for division, or something that's been like a component that the page has been divided into, right? And then inside the div, you will find the h1, which stands for header one, and a paragraph, and another paragraph, and inside the paragraph you will see some text, and another paragraph will contain a link with some more information. A stands for anchor, right? And href stands for hypertext reference, and it's a reference, anchor reference to this particular page. All right, so it's a little bit too much right now, but at least somewhat of an introduction of what a web page is. I think it would be a good idea to now do two things. First, we can create one ourselves and see if we can come up with something at least somewhat similar to what this is. And then in order to do this, we need to kind of know what are the tags that are available to us, right? What are the tags that the browser knows how to interpret, right? So clearly it knows how to interpret HTML tag and head and body and div and h1 and p, right? But what other tags are out there? What other tags are available to us? So we basically need a manual on how can we write some HTML in a meaningful way so that the browser understands what the hell we want from it, right? So Google to the rescue, list of, let's do of HTML tags. There we go. Immediately a bunch of resources pop up. W3 Schools is somewhat reputable. You can use that, but if you go sort of beyond the sponsored or like highlighted section in the Google page, you'll probably find a better result. And here is the really reputable source. It's developer.mozilla.org. Mozilla is the makers of Firefox, one of the major browsers and one of the major players in the web space, and so they host this manual for the web, for all components of the web and everything that you need to know about the web. So if you go into their references page of their website, and specifically the HTML reference, you will find something like that, right? So here are all of the HTML elements that are available to us. If you see a little trash can next to it, like an acronym, right? It's a deprecated one. So at some point it was used, but no longer. And they're kind of explaining why it's not used anymore and what you should be using instead, and so on and so forth, right? So things like acronym and big and center, they're not used anymore. So if you want to write a modern web page, you probably should avoid them. But if you want to make sure that your browser, if you're creating like a browser from scratch, which is, some people do that, you might want to consider including the interpretation mechanisms for these tags as well, right? So here's where we'll find our A, right? Remember that A stands for anchor, right? Widely available, compatible with all the major browsers, and it's an HTML element or anchor element. With its href attribute, it creates a hyperlink to other web pages, files, email addresses, locations on the same page, or anything else that can be an address. For example, a phone number. You can create an href that would make a phone number, right? And it would link to an application that would make a phone call, as is the example here, right? So it's telephone, and then you would include the phone number. Right, so there are all kinds of links that you can create with your anchor, right? So let's scroll down a little bit. Here's another familiar element, body, right? We've already encountered the body. It's an HTML element that represents the content of an HTML document, right? So that's going to be our content. That's what you will see on the page. As opposed to, for example, scroll a little bit down, they're all in alphabetical order, as opposed to a head of the document, which contains machine-readable information or metadata about the document. Right? That's what we talked about, and you'll find the same information here. Right? So you will find other things and other options like well, not frame set. Frame set is deprecated, but H1. And lo and behold, there's not just H1, it's H1 through H6. There's 6 different levels of headings that are available to you under HTML. And here's a little example. So the biggest one is H1, then H2 is a little smaller, H3 is smaller yet, and so on and so forth, right? So you can go between H1 and H6. We can look at something like, well, what have we encountered so far? Div, right? Div was an important component. It's a generic container for flow content, right? So it's just like a piece of divided content, as far as I understand it, for example, right? You can create divs that will contain other things. So for example, here we have a div that contains an image and a paragraph, right? So let's look at image then. And so an image is going to be a way for you to embed images into content, into your document. All right, so that gives us quite a set of options, right? And we can start combining those options to create a web page. So let's do it. Following the example, we'll start with the first line that says doc type HTML. So this is just a first line declaration. It has to be on the first line, and it basically says everything that's going to follow below is going to be HTML content, so start interpreting it as such, right? If you had any doubts about what kind of content I'm going to be supplying to you, doubt no longer, it is going to be HTML. So we can say doc type like this, HTML. Okay, so HTML opening tag and closing tag. So it automatically closed HTML for me. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you guys can see a little bit better. And I'm going to keep my Explorer to the minimum. So right now, the only thing we have there is index.html file, and that's good enough. So, okay, so we looked at the structure and we learned that head and body are going to be the 2 components. Okay, so let's enter. So I have a suggestion pop up to add a title, right? So this is what we want. Let's start with adding a title. And it's going to be, sure, my first web page. Good enough. So we've entered a title, and we can now head on to the body, and again, it gives us a bunch of suggestions, and that's fine, but we're going to type it all up ourselves. So we're going to have an H1, and we're going to say my first web page. Let's capitalize this. And for the paragraph, you can find a piece of lorem ipsum, or let's try lorem ipsum. VS Code includes little snippets that are available to you. So if you see something like this pop up, so if I start typing lorem, it offers the auto completion for me. So I can press tab, and it's going to insert a couple of sentences of lorem ipsum for me. So that's great. So I'm going to save this. And how do I open this now? Right, so first let's open this folder in the browser. I mean, in the Finder or in the Explorer if you're on Windows. And you will find that index.html in there, right? So here it is in the Explorer in the VS Code. Here it is in the Finder in my Mac OS. And you would open it just like you open any file. You can say open with Firefox, or you can drag and drop it into the Firefox window. And here it is. This is my first web page, right? So it doesn't look exactly like this one, but there are certain similarities, right? It's by default, as you notice, it's a serif font, and it's a white background, and it doesn't have certain ornamental properties that this page has, but it's nonetheless quite a web page. And if you open up the inspector, you will see exactly the same thing that you found in the example domain. You will find it right here. Okay, fantastic. So this is our first web page. We are quite on track to writing something great. So now let's try to add a little bit more content to it. We're going to switch over to VS Code, and let's try to include two things. We're going to try to include a link, and we're going to try to include an image, right? So let's start with an image. So unlike header 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or a paragraph or a body or a div that have the opening tag and the closing tag, right? Notice that you have a P opening and a P closing, an H1 opening and an H1 closing, and in fact, VS Code will highlight the corresponding opening or closing tag if you hover over one of them, right? So here I'm hovering over the opening tag, and it's highlighting the closing. Here I'm hovering over the closing tag, and it's highlighting the opening one for me, right? So image doesn't have it because it's kind of weird way of like how it works, because image just simply references a file, a separate file, not a file, not some kind of like a content of HTML. It actually just references contents of your image file, right? So it doesn't have a closing tag. So you can call it self-closing like this, right? So you just kind of close it at the end of the opening tag, or you can just skip the self-closing part depending on how strictly you want to adhere to the standards. Browsers by now are fairly flexible that way, right? They will understand what you're trying to tell them either way. But there are two components to the image that you have to include in order for it to be valid, or in order for browsers to interpret them properly, and also to ensure appropriate accessibility. So first of all, you have to include the source, and the source, or encoded as src, is the location of your image file, right? And then the other one is alt. Alt, or alternative, is the description of the image. And it's really important if your image file doesn't load for some reason, or if the person who's looking at your web page is not a seeing person, they will rely on alt description to understand what was supposed to be on the page at that spot, right? So as for the sources of the images, you have a ton of options. So since everything on the web is just, a file that's located on somebody's computer, you can point to an image that's located on your own computer, and you can point to an image that's located on somebody else's computer, right? So let's look at two options that way. I'm gonna grab an image, and I'm gonna look for my favorite animal, quokka, right? And I'm gonna go to images, find an image of quokka, something like this, maybe, right? It's really big. It's like 3,000 pixels. It's gonna take a bit of time to load, so maybe I'll find a somewhat smaller image of what this looks smaller, right? So if I open this image in a new tab, it will give me the address of this image, and this is a really, really long address with a whole bunch of stuff at the end. But we can use it, right? Or maybe we can find a Quokka file with a simpler address. So let's find something like this, somewhat simpler, somewhat shorter, right? But honestly, for our intents and purposes right now, it's not that important because I'm going to download this image. So I'm going to save this image as, and I'm going to save it into the folder that I just created, right next to my index.html. I'm going to save it there. And so here you will see that I have a WebP image of a Quokka, right? So I can rename it. Let's call it Quokka1 WebP, and then I can specify that this is in fact the image that I want. Notice how it showed up right next to the index, right? And so I will just say I need to give a path to this image, right? So how can my browser find the image wherever it is located, whether it's located in the same folder or whether it's located on somebody else's computer, right? So if it was located on somebody else's computer, all I have to do is just give it the URL to that image. So let's try this out. Let's copy this, paste this here, so the entire URL, and then let's call it image of a cute Quokka, right? Perfect. So that I have a description, I have a path to the image. So now if I go here and reload, I have the image showing up on my page, right? So, and if I were to inspect this page, you'll notice that this description is there, and if somehow this breaks, at least I will have that description available, right? But then what about the image that's located on our own folder, right? So the rule of thumb is, so here you'll see it starts with HTTPS, which is the kind of protocol, and then the subdomain and the domain that apparently it's hosted by Reddit, but somehow the Reddit rented a computer on an Italian server somewhere and called it red.it, and then placed the file there, and all those other parameters will allow us to fetch that exact file and not something else, right? But what if I want to fetch that file from my own computer? Well, I start from the location of my index file, right? And so if I start from the location of my index file, Quokka1 is going to be right there. So I can just say Quokka1.webp, and it will be reloaded now from this source, right? Fantastic. But what if I want to have a bunch of images of Quokkas, and I don't want them all to be in the same folder as my HTML pages? So I'm going to go into my folder, into my website, and create a new folder there and call it images. That's where I'm going to be storing all my images. I'm going to place my Quokka image in there, right? So we'll save this and then reload our page, and everything is breaking now because the place where we found that Quokka image before that image is no longer there, right? So now we just have a description image of a cute Quokka showing up on the page and not the image itself. Why? Well, that's very simple, because it's no longer available just at the same level as our index.html. So first, if we want to start at index.html and locate the image of Quokka, we need to first go inside the images folder, and then you will find the Quokka image, right? So you need to describe that exact path to your browser as well. So you're going to say start at images / right, Quokka1.webp. Okay, so if I correct it this way, I should be able to get the image of Quokka back, right? Because now we're specifying the correct path. So now if you look at another image of Quokka, something like this, maybe let's open it up in a new tab, right? So here you will see that the image is located on this natgeofe.com site, and then inside folder K, inside folder B33A3, and so on, so on, and so on. So those are just folder names, just like our folder name, right? Not particularly human readable folders. Probably not that many humans look at those folders, probably none at all. And those are just automatically named, right? But those are just folders on somebody's computer. And if we look at another image, let's again open image in a new tab. So we'll see that this one is located on wwf.org.au, so Australia, which makes sense. Quokka is from Australia. Folder called image and then inside folder image, there is a folder upload. And there is inside that, there's a folder C_fill, G_auto, yada, 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 yada. And so all of those are just folders, and there are quite a few of them on that computer. And inside that folder, fundamentally, that's where the image is located, right? So this is a really important concept because this is how you're going to be creating links to other files, right? So this is how the web works, by connecting different files, whether it's one HTML file to another HTML file, or an image inside an HTML file, or anything else, right? So this is a fundamental concept that you want to be able to start at your file, which is in this case located on the desktop, first website, index.html, and then traverse the file structure and find the file that you're looking for wherever you need to find it. Okay, so let's try it again. This time we're gonna try by adding an anchor. So we are gonna go back to our text and we're gonna find a few words, right? Let's say these 3 words, right? And we're gonna make them an anchor to another web page. So we'll start an anchor tag before Amit, and then we'll end it before Elit, right? So that means that these 3 words are going to be the anchor to a location of another page. So I then need to specify the location of another page, href, right? And then I need to say what that location is. And let's say I want the example domain to be that location. I want to link to it. So here it is. Now if I save this, you'll be able to go to your page, reload it, and then here we go. We're loading an example domain. Notice that it's loading in the same window, right? Oftentimes when you click on a link, it actually opens another tab in your browser. That's something that you can specify as a parameter for your link, and you'll find more information about it over here in the manual of our HTML tags. So it will list all the parameters that are available for you and how you can specify them. But that specific parameter is target. And if you want to open it in a new tab, you need to say blank. So it's going to open a blank tab or a blank window and load that location there. So if I do it target equals underscore blank, and then save. If I save, it's very important to save, and then reload the page in the browser. Now if I click on it, it opens up in a new tab, and this old tab is still open here. All right, so we have a page, we have some components on that page, and we fundamentally performing the function that web was supposed to perform, which is connect different files together. So we've connected one page to another page, and we connected an image to our own page. Okay, so next time we're going to talk a little bit more about how you can publish this. Right, because right now, if you notice in the URL, it still says file, users, my name, and desktop, and whatever. So this is not on the web, right? Because it's not being loaded from an HTTP protocol. So we're not tapping a server, we're just simply loading a file from my computer, right? So in order to do that, we're gonna start diving into version control, and I'm gonna talk about what version control is, and we're gonna start looking at a tool called GitHub. And if you're familiar with it, fantastic. And if not, then we'll talk about this and how GitHub can actually host files for us and host web pages and websites for us. And it's absolutely free, and so why not use it, right? And then we'll also start talking about CSS, and CSS is used in order to introduce layout and color and typography into your web pages. So in other words, provide style. Right, so and we're gonna start looking at how to now start styling our pages. But that's it for now. And if you have any questions, do let me know, and I'll be more than happy to answer each and every one of them. All right, see you soon. Bye, everybody.